Good evening, and thank you for joining us for tonight's program, First Responders and Emergency Preparedness. My name is Siobhán Alvarez, and I'm the Executive Director of the Atlanta Autism Consortium. If this is your first time joining one of our programs, welcome. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to creating collaborative connections throughout the Metro Atlanta autism community. We host free programs and events every month and aim to serve the spectrum at large, including parents and family members, adults with autism, researchers, clinicians, and educators. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. Please know that your microphone will remain muted, but you can feel free to ask any questions throughout the event by typing them into the chat box, which is located at the bottom of your screen. After the presentation, we will have a Q&A session to wrap up the night with all of our panelists, so we'll be sure that any questions that are asked are brought to them. You'll also receive an email after tonight's presentation, either tonight or tomorrow morning, with the contact information for all of our panelists from this evening. That way, if you have any questions for them that you'd like to reach out to them one-on-one, you have that information. This evening, we are joined by Pat Strode of the Georgia Public Safety Training Center Crisis Intervention Team, Lieutenant Ayana of the Brookhaven Police Department, Chris Sims of the Coweta County Fire and Rescue Department, Russell Shoemake of the a community paramedic with Coweta County Fire and Rescue, and Dr. Nadrat Nuhu, assistant professor in the Department of Pediatrics, Division of Autism and Related Disabilities at the Emory University School of Medicine. Dr. Nuhu, would you like to take things from here?
Yes, thank you. I just want to start off by saying thank you to all of our panelists for joining us here tonight. This is an issue that continues to come up in the clinical services that I provide to my families with children who have autism and related disorders. So it definitely is something that I think is on the minds of our community, and I'm really happy that you guys were willing to join us in this discussion. So when thinking about autism and thinking about other developmental disabilities, it's very evident when thinking about those symptoms how it can impact the individual's ability to respond in a crisis situation. And even the symptoms themselves of the disorder may make it more likely these individuals need first responder assistance when they're engaging in or experiencing pretty difficult emotional times at home. It may escalate to a level that requires first responder assistance, especially when caregivers have been attempting to manage or are just kind of at their end of their rope in regards to what else to try to kind of help take care of their child and to also keep themselves safe. So I think that this is an amazing opportunity for us to kind of learn more from first responders regarding what to expect when they need to call first responder assistance, and even information regarding when to call for a first responder and what situations are best for first responders to help out with. So I appreciate you guys for being here. I would first like to start off with each of you walking us through your specific department, any programming that you are specifically responsible for in regards to mental health and servicing the community, and really just kind of introducing us to how you serve your communities. Chris, could you start us off?
Sure thing. My name is Lieutenant Chris Sims. I work for the Coweta County Fire and Rescue Department. I am the coordinator for our peer support team, dealing with mental health, PTSD, things of that nature with our firefighters. I've been with Coweta County now 22.5 years, and our primary program that we utilize for customer type basis is our Coweta Cares program, which I'll let Russell go a little further in depth in. Russell is the director of our Coweta Cares program.
Wonderful. Russell?
I'm Russell Shoemake. I am a firefighter, community paramedic with Coweta County Fire Rescue. I've been in the fire service 26 years. I started doing this as my full-time job when we launched the program 2.5 years ago. Community mobile integrated health community paramedic programs are to be proactive on frequent 911 callers, and when you do those, for those programs, you do your studies to show which 911 calls are overwhelming your system, and most of the time it's going to be mental health calls. Most of your departments in your counties, that's going to be the #1 priority. We have a partnership with our community service board, Pathways. We have a clinician that rides with us. We respond to 911 calls Anything that comes out that's substance abuse or mental health related, we'll respond. We also conduct follow-ups. We'll conduct home visits if someone calls us directly and says, we were given your number by PD or Sheriff's Department. Can you reach out to this person and see if you can help them out? And we try to get them in resources or whatever that's available in the area.
Wonderful. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that program as we kind of go through our questions. Lieutenant Ayana.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Abram Ayana. I'm a lieutenant with the City of Brookhaven Police Department, located in DeKalb County. My primary assignment is the Criminal Investigations Division, where I'm the supervisor in charge there. In addition to that, I do oversee our drone program as well as our crisis intervention team. And that crisis intervention team is a partnership that we forged with Behavioral Health Link to provide licensed professional counselors and mental health professionals and embed them within the police department to respond to mental health crisis and those types of calls. I also lead our department's efforts to train our officers in crisis intervention. Crisis intervention is a 40-hour training curriculum that is presently run through the the Georgia Public Safety Training Center that teaches primarily police officers who are responding to emergency calls to recognize the signs and symptoms of mental illness and when they're dealing with the mental health community, as well as teaching them skills to de-escalate. And so that is an additional role that I do have the opportunity to participate in. Presently, the Brookhaven Police Department has trained well over 50% of our officers in that 40-hour crisis intervention training. And that number fluctuates depending on the personnel that we bring on board. But it is the chief's continuing goal to make sure that 100% of our officers are trained in that curriculum.
Wonderful. So the first question I have for you guys, which is one that does come up often when I'm working with families and I'm trying to kind of provide them additional resources, they always ask me, when is the appropriate time to bring in a first responder? I do think that that is a question that sometimes feels like it should be intuitive, but I think it's one that families sometimes struggle with. So based on your experience working in the community, when do families typically contact first responders during emergency situations when they have a child with autism or developmental disability?
Well, I'll kick it off. So typically what we've seen is two completely different ends of the spectrum. There are families that will wait hours into an emergency, hours after their child has gone missing, because they've assumed that they will come home rather quickly, or they've done it before. And they figure they might be at a friend's house. And a lot of times, if we're waiting an hour or 2 hours to contact first responders to come and help locate a child, we've waited a lot of times too long. And that's very pertinent when you're dealing with an autistic child who may wander. We know a lot of times that children with autism do tend to wander, and if they're nearby a body of water, that could be potentially very deadly and dangerous. And we've seen that happen time and time again. And so we always encourage folks, hey, don't delay contacting us, because that delay can oftentimes be deadly. So I would encourage anyone with a loved one that would have autism or any other developmental or mental health issue or challenge to make sure that you are very, very prompt, because if you delay or wait to call us, that could be a very, very bad thing. And if you contact us early and we're able to help you intervene in the crisis, then oftentimes that is a good resolution for you. So no problem is too small for us. We'd rather be there and not be needed than to have been needed, been delayed, and that a lot of times hampers us from having a positive result.
I'll also tag on to Lieutenant Ariana. The other thing is, obviously, when dealing with autism, parents sometimes are so emotionally attached to the situation that they're not always able to calm the situation. And a lot of times getting someone in as soon as possible before we reach a complete meltdown, an outside source that's more calm, that's able to control emotions a little bit better, is something that we see at Coweta. The sooner we get our first responders in, number one, we can take care of mom and dad who are emotionally charged, and we can start the process of finding out, what self-soothing techniques the child may need and what we need to do to start calming that situation down. Obviously, as Lieutenant said, anytime we're dealing with autistic child or autistic adult that wanders, the sooner we get there, the quicker we can locate them before we do have a crisis. As he touched base, it is a very, very high probability, and I'll recommend any parent on tonight that are dealing with autistic children that do wander, get on Google Maps, get on Google Earth, locate your closest bodies of water. Public safety may not know about those. And as soon as you call us with that child missing, be able to tell them, these are my closest bodies of water, because for some reason they're mesmerizing to the kids.
I'd like to add on to that too. I've noticed that when we get calls, most of the time the parents will say, they know where their baseline is. Sometimes and once they've gone over that baseline and they're having a severe episode, they're throwing things, they're breaking things. By the time they usually call us, that's already escalated to that, and they're just to the point where they're ready to give up. And that's what they usually say. I don't have anything left. I'm tired. I'm frustrated. I need a break. Please take them somewhere. So they wait so long to where it's just that they're just grasping at straws for help at that point. And if they're more proactive, we can get in there early before things get broken or something gets thrown or scratching and clawing or punching or whatever. It seems like to me they want to try to handle it themselves until they just can't anymore. And that's when we get the calls for 911.
Yeah. And I think that is a sentiment that I've heard a lot about as well with the population I work with, where they really want to try initially to manage as much as possible before bringing in first responders. But what I'm hearing from you guys is that it's probably better to call earlier because you have more options at that stage.
Right. Yeah, I would say that to be the case 100%. We often see a lot of times, and speaking as mental health as a whole, we wait till the crisis situations are truly crisis situations. And a lot of times that leads the law enforcement officer responding at a critical, very, very critical point. Weapons may have already been secured and someone may be armed where they weren't armed 10, 15 minutes ago. Report escalated. And that law enforcement officer, the higher the hyperactivity of the situation, the distress of the situation, the less tools they may have available to them. And a lot of times we forget that the first thing that they're thinking of is safety, not just their own personal safety, but the safety of the fire and EMS that may be arriving, or the safety of the family members who are in the house. And a lot of times folks are not thinking, when they think of weapons, they think in the traditional sense, no, he doesn't have a gun or she doesn't have a gun. But if they have access to knives in the house, that's an additional weapon. So a lot of times we see those situations where the law enforcement officers responding, someone has already secured a weapon and they never actually have a time to de-escalate. That's one of the things we teach about with de-escalation. De-escalation is a great thing. It's a great tool, but you can't de-escalate a lot of times if someone is in possession of a deadly weapon. And so that's a lot of times if we've seen that situation get so far out of control and we haven't called when cooler heads could have prevailed or it wasn't so hot, those things tend to spiral out of control on us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I imagine that part of, and this is a question I have later on, but I think I'm going to go ahead and ask it now because we're talking about how to make sure things don't escalate. And thinking about your work and your experience, what are some things that families can do preemptively to prepare for these types of situations to help it be a smoother transition? So it seems like the earlier they call, the better, but is there anything else they can do even before that step, before it even occurs?
I think one of the largest suggestions that I have seen coming from a 911 dispatcher side is most all of our dispatch centers are now operating using a CAD system. Reach out to your 911 center, look up your 911 center's non-emergency number and call them. They can attach notes based upon your child's name or the adult's name, the person with autism. They can attach notes based upon street addresses. They can attach notes based upon vehicles. If you have an adult person that has autism that still drives, reach out to them. They can put those notes into the system. That way, when we are dispatched to either a suspicious person or we're dispatched to a person that's acting out of the ordinary, we already have those notes in front of us that say you are dealing with an autistic person, not a person that's overdosing on drugs. And that way, our public safety personnel approach that situation totally different. When we receive a call for an autistic person that is acting out, we're in a totally different mindset than if we receive a suspicious person call, someone that's standing in the street screaming and yelling at everybody. You look at it from a drug overdose versus a autistic person is two totally different scenarios. So by all means, reach out to your 911 centers and let them know the diagnosis, let them know what they drive, what they may be, where they may be. That way those notes can get to us early on in dispatch.
Yeah, I'll also piggyback on what Lieutenant Sands was saying. A lot of agencies, and I know agencies, one of them, there's this thing called Smart 911, where you have the ability to go online if the agency participates in Smart 911 and add that information in as well. A lot of times we see those situations where a neighbor, and this is, I think, an important point, is to get to know your neighbors. Because if your neighbor doesn't know that you have an autistic child in your home or an autistic adult living with you, they may see someone that they don't recognize behaving in a manner that's suspicious to them, because that's not normal for what they're used to. And they may contact 911 and say, hey, there's a person just standing outside my neighbor's home or standing in the carport. They're not saying anything. They're not doing anything. And that's suspicious. And then a lot of times law enforcement or another first responders dispatch and they have contact with them and they didn't know what to look for, or they were not thinking. There's this thing called dispatch priming, where officers are primed by what they're told in the 911 calls. And so if your neighbor's saying, hey, there's someone that doesn't live there that's behaving abnormally, the officer may think, okay, there's some criminal activity going on. And then they walk into a situation, not necessarily thinking, hey, this is a mental health call, versus, hey, this is someone that is participating in some sort of criminal activity. So the more information that you can give us is always the better. Another one that I'm a strong proponent of, if you have small children or teenage age children, school age children, is having them around the police department and police officers as frequently as you can. So take them out of the police station, introduce them to the officers. So the officers are on patrol and they see them. And a lot of times, old school cops say, if I speak to somebody, they don't speak to me. That's not normal. Because typically, if you don't have anything to hide, if you've not done anything wrong, you don't have a problem engaging with the police officers or waving and speaking. And they might not necessarily say, hey, this is an autistic person, so they may be nonverbal, and they may not recognize that right off the bat. And so they may see that as another, hey, why won't that person look at me when I drive by in the police car? I think we're all here on the video chat. If we see a cop drive by, the first thing we do is we look at the car. Number one, are they here? Is this a police officer in my neighborhood? Is this, my local police officer? Is this the sheriff's office somewhere else? Or is this the FBI? Because there's certain agencies, when you see them in your neighborhood, you go, oh, they're looking for somebody, right? And so, we've always said, if I'm a cop and I'm in a marked car and I pull up next to somebody at a red light, like right next to you, and you don't look at me, why are they looking at me? That's odd, because everybody looks at the cop to see, hey, are they checking me out? But at the same time, someone who's autistic, they might avoid eye contact and things of that sort. And so oftentimes police officers, especially if they haven't been seasoned or they haven't been exposed to someone with autism, may not be able to recognize that, hey, this is something other than criminal activity. And so I strongly encourage, if you have small children, bring them around the police department, just to introduce them to the officers, because in that moment, you're introducing them to your loved one. The officers are starting to recognize, hey, I went to some training and I heard about autism, but I've never interacted with someone with autism face to face. And they may learn something from that interaction that they would not otherwise learn in training.
Mm-hmm.
Also a good thing, as far as what both lieutenants were talking about, getting in touch with your 911, is some of these programs you can upload a picture as well. So if you have an autistic child, go ahead and upload the most frequent picture to them. So then, like, law enforcement's rolling down on a suspicious person and they have whatever reason to look cross-reference it and look at the picture, then they'll know immediately who this person is. Because we have run into that recently, and we have HelloFresh here in Coweta, and we got a unknown problem person psychiatric problem. Well, it was a deaf, nonverbal 20-year-old male whose mother was homeless. He's in the car in the parking lot, and she worked at HelloFresh. HelloFresh is a huge building in our industrial area. Well, he woke. His brother fell asleep in the car. The brother walked into the maintenance shop, and just so happened somebody there tried sign language, and he knew sign language, and we was able to de-escalate because we couldn't communicate with him. He couldn't speak to us. All he could do was he kept hitting himself and making noises, and I was like, oh, what are we gonna do now? Luckily, one of the EMS crew members tried sign language, and immediately he started answering.
Oh, wow. That's great. And I think that's really helpful to know that not only can you provide information regarding your child, your loved one before the interaction, but also pictures. I love the suggestion of bringing them to the specific first responder agencies and having them meet people that are in uniform, getting them used to interacting with first responders. I think that's also a wonderful suggestion. So you both, or all three of you, have mentioned specialized programs, either training programs for the crisis intervention team programming, and then the care program. Can you tell us a little bit more about these specialized mental health units that are designed to help families with mental health needs, and kind of what makes these programs special and what families can expect from them?
I guess I'll go first this time. The Coyote Cares, like I said, that when they determined the need for our 911 or hospital overwhelming calls, or the mental health calls. So when we partnered up with the Community Service Board, that's our number. We do many things, but the mental health is the priority that we're doing. So we have the clinician, we have a licensed professional counselor ride with us, or a licensed clinical social worker. The paramedic can determine if it's a medical issue. If it's not a medical issue, we even have a breathalyzer on our unit, not for criminal purposes, but just to rule out alcohol being part of the reason. We determine it's not a medical issue, then the clinician steps in and they do their assessment, and they can determine whether to do the involuntary commitment or not. And a lot of times we're able to do crisis resolved on scenes, whether it's just going to pick up someone's medication because they didn't have a ride, or helping them schedule an outpatient appointment, or whatever it is that pushed them over the limit to snap at this point, whether it be lack of medication, stress in their life, whatever it is. We try to find the cause of the root of the problem and stop that and fix that. And I'm like, when we went and picked up someone's medication, we ran her one time about a year and a half ago and haven't heard from her since. So we crisis resolved. She was able to get her insurance shortly after that, and she got into some outpatient programs, got her medicine on time, and we call that a successful crisis resolved. And so what we try to do is intervene and keep folks out of jail, out of the ER, into the appropriate care facility.
Wonderful. So you are responding to these calls and identifying what the specific need is and trying to get that need met.
Correct.
In addition to that, the CIT program is not a program that teaches officers to diagnose any sort of mental illness. What it does is teaches them to recognize the signs and symptoms. But beyond that, it teaches them how to de-escalate. And so we talk about de-escalation. That's been the buzzword the last couple of years, right? And folks automatically assume that de-escalation is an end-all be-all. And we've seen that that's not the case. Oftentimes, if an officer walks into a situation where someone's already presented a weapon, is in possession of a weapon, oftentimes, the officers are not necessarily, it's not in the best interest of anybody, specifically an officer who has a family to go home to walk into a deadly situation, a deadly force situation where they could be gravely injured or killed and not be prepared to defend themselves or another person. So that program teaches them de-escalation and how to recognize signs and symptoms. But the first thing that they always stress in that program is to never jeopardize the officer's personal safety or the safety of others. And so we say that oftentimes after a critical incident, when an officer has been involved in a use of force involving a mental health consumer, that the outcries about crisis intervention training, show me where crisis intervention training was trained, or was this officer trained, or were they not trained? And we often tell folks, say that crisis intervention is not the end all be all. But what it does is it gives the officer a baseline set of skills to be able to recognize the signs and symptoms of mental illness. So that's number one. And then in the past couple of years, you started seeing more and more law enforcement organizations bringing on mental health professionals and embedding them with their agency and the response. And so you started seeing a conversation about social workers. Instead of sending police officers to calls, we would send social workers to calls. And there have been some situations where we recognize that, hey, sending a social worker to a call where someone's is armed or has been violent is not the best thing to do, because that social worker is not trained to defend themselves or is not equipped to defend themselves against a deadly threat. And so we found that the best opportunity for us and the best choice was to create what we call this co-responder or co-location response, where the public safety organization, the police department, the fire department, the EMS agency is able to not just send a mental health professional out and say, okay, good luck. When you get there, hopefully the person is not armed, but hey, we'll send that first responder out as well and allow them to make sure the scene is safe for you to enter. And so we've done that successfully here in Brookhaven for over the past year, for several over hundreds of times, to dispatch those professionals to those scenes. And what we've seen a lot of times is that families and mental health consumers, patients have not necessarily been linked to long-term care. They've always been linked to care that has been for that crisis moment, right? And so they don't necessarily have that long-term therapeutic care, the long-term social support and all those other things. And those clinicians, our clinicians, are able to introduce them to some sort of long-term support to get them into to being able to afford their medicines where they otherwise would not have been able to afford those medicines, or connect them to support groups like NAMI. And here in Brookhaven, we have a very successful relationship with NAMI, the National Alliance of Mental Illness. And NAMI is a great organization. I would strongly encourage any family member or loved one of a person with mental illness to connect with NAMI, because NAMI has support groups for all sorts of mental illness, not just autism, but schizophrenia and all those other illnesses that provide support to families around the clock, and provide resources. And that's another resource organization that we always promote. And then another that always comes to mind when you're dealing with someone who could potentially wander is Project Lifesaver. Project Lifesaver is one of the best organizations if you have a loved one with Alzheimer's, any sort of illness that has with it the ability or the likelihood that loved one will wander. And what Project Lifesaver does is it equips with some of the latest technology, whether it be a GPS-enabled bracelet. So if your loved one goes missing, they can come out, bring out with a homing beacon that they point, and it directs the first responder to your loved one's location, and that brings about a successful recovery, versus those long drawn out operations where you see those Maddie's calls and those Levi's calls that last for several days and unfortunately don't return the loved one successfully.
I'll also follow up with our training that we go through here at Coweta Fire. I wish Miss Pat Strode was still with us. The Georgia Public Safety Training Center offers us, the public safety professional, numerous training opportunities in and around both autism, Asperger's syndrome, along with a lot of mental health. I don't know if you guys can see this or not. One of the classes just recently, autism and de-escalation class, that is an online class that is put on by Georgia Public Safety Training Center. These are tools. They offer numerous classes that help us as public safety professionals better understand and better deal with the calls. I think a lot of parents are more hesitant to reach out to us because they've heard the horror stories of, my son just teetotally went overboard, and I called 911 and the police department got there and they fought with him, they attacked him, they handcuffed him. those stories don't happen as much as they used to because of these training programs. We now understand more that when dealing with an autistic person, it's a more hands-off approach, that physical touch tends to escalate the situation even more. And these training programs that you brought up are what are allowing us as public safety personnel to deal with the situations and de-escalate the situations. So the parents need to understand that we're not just arriving like the war stories you've heard in the past. We're not just arriving and manhandling the situation, that we do have programs. Coweta County is currently in communications with a national certification organization. They offer a training and certification for our first responders that is strictly based upon autism. And they actually certify you as a nationally recognized autism department. So there's numerous training opportunities that are out there that weren't 10 years ago. So I challenged all of the parents that are watching to reach out to your public safety and ask them what type of training that their personnel have. I think you'd be surprised to actually see that we do more training. I know on the fire department side, we're required to do 280 hours a year of continuing education. And a lot of those are these mental health programs. So we are taking a lot more time on these training classes and these programs that we're speaking about.
I love to hear that. And it does sound like there is definitely a concerted effort to make sure that you guys are receiving the exposure to the population that is definitely in need of your services, which is wonderful. So I think one thing that'd be very helpful is to kind of walk us through from start to finish what to expect from a first responder if called to assist during a behavioral crisis. So when I say that, I'm talking about an individual who is in the moment engaging in aggressive and disruptive behaviors, and that is the reason why first responder has been called. The first question I have really is, who typically responds when a family calls 911 to request assistance if the family doesn't provide additional information regarding their child's diagnosis, or if they don't provide additional information requesting a specific agency? If they are just calling and they are pretty emotional and saying they need help, who could they expect to show up?
Well, I'll start off with that. 911 centers, when they receive the call, they have to code it. Okay, so if it's either going to be coded as a general sickness, unknown problem, or psychiatric. But anytime that they meet certain criteria, you're going to get law enforcement, probably a fire engine, a med unit, which an ambulance, and then like in Coweta County, when we're in service, they'll either go ahead and dispatch us or we'll pick up on the call. So you're going to get law enforcement. They're going to clear the scene first. They do that every time for any kind of psychiatric, mental health, assault calls and things like that. Once they determine that there's no active weapons present, or anybody pointing guns or anything like that, they'll tell the scene's clear. We'll stage and we'll go into the scene. The law enforcement officers already made contact with the patient and the family members. We'll come in, and if we do know if this is an autistic patient, a lot of times here I'll tell the engine crew or the medic crew, I'll be like, let's don't everybody go running in at one time and overwhelm their senses. One or two of us may go in and make contact, and then at the end of the day, our goal is to get those people back in service. So if we tell law enforcement or the med unit, like, hey, we got this, guys, you guys can go back in service for the calls. So what they can expect is the minimum of law enforcement and an ambulance at the very minimum, but you probably get a fire truck in some places too, and a crisis response unit, depending on where you're at.
Yeah, to piggyback off what Russell was saying, a lot of times you've seen in the media where these situations have turned tragic, and folks say, we wanted, EMS or paramedics to come, and they sent the police or they sent the sheriff's office, they sent an armed police officer when my loved one was just experiencing a mental health crisis and they just needed an ambulance. Why would you send an armed police officer? And he hit the nail right on the head. It is because the law enforcement officer has an obligation to make sure that that scene is safe before our partners in the fire service and EMS arrive on the scene. And so a lot of times that's why you would see a police officer or a sheriff's deputy respond to those calls, even when it's not requested. And so oftentimes you'll see that happen. The police officer or the sheriff's deputy would arrive. They determine that the scene is safe. And then you may see the fire EMS come in if a crisis unit is not available, come in and make an assessment of your loved one. And a lot of times they typically ask them a battery of questions. And there are times that you may see that your loved one may be able to answer those questions. A lot of times the questions have been, who's the president of the United States? And for the past, as long as I can remember, the presidents have been pretty, remarkable and memorable. And so that was a question that was pretty easy for folks to answer, who the president of the United States was. Or they may ask him, what's the day of the week? Or do you know where you are? And things of that sort. And if they were able to provide the answer to that question, you may know that your loved one is not, behaving like themselves or thinking like their normal selves. The EMS personnel may say, hey, based upon our requirements, we cannot involuntarily transport them. And so you've contacted 911 because your loved one is in a crisis and an emergency, and you've asked them who the president was. Well, the presidents are pretty remarkable. He, like I said, in the past 20 plus years, so you can't not know who the president is, right? And so they know the answer to that question, like, oh my gosh, he's torn the house up, or he just ran out the house naked, or, he hasn't eaten in 3 days, and they may say, hey, I'm sorry, but I can't transport your loved one. And you turn and look at the law enforcement officer, and you expect the police officer to just snatch him up, throw him in the back of the ambulance and say, you got to go. Well, unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. That's kidnapping in the state of Georgia. And there's a movement in the legislature right now to change the laws that give us the power to involuntarily transport someone for that mental health evaluation. The law does not give us the authority to just take your loved one to the mental health hospital and get treatment and make them take their medication. That is a common misconception. That's not the way it works. That's not the way it's ever worked. What the law does give us the ability to do, based on a small criteria, is to transport them for an evaluation. And the emergency receiving facility has a specific amount of time to conduct an evaluation and determine, hey, whether or not they're going to place a hold, or whether or not they're going to release your family member, because they're a free person. This is America, right? And so there have been situations where we have seen the clinicians come out in our crisis unit, sign an order to take them for that involuntary evaluation, not treatment, just that evaluation, and the loved one been released just hours later. And you're like, why are they back when they just took them to, Charter Peachford, Ridgeview Institute, any number of facilities, and they were just here and they just signed the 1013 and they're back 8, 10, 12, maybe 3 or 4 hours later, and they've done the same thing, and they got scissors, and it's escalating. And you see those families say, we called for help and nobody helped us. And our hands are tied. Our hands are truly, 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 truly tied. And so oftentimes, if they're not willing to go voluntarily, we can't take them involuntarily. And we definitely cannot involuntarily mandate that they get treatment. And so we found, and I like Russell said, I wish Pat was still here, because Pat would tell you, we found that when people are voluntarily connecting with treatment, that's when the treatment works best, and we see the best long-term effect. But if somebody's in a crisis and they're going involuntarily, we see that a lot of times, hey, that doesn't necessarily work. And our mental health facilities are overwhelmed. You can go down to the Grady psychiatric facility, and see at any time they're overwhelmed. And at any point, these facilities are on psychiatric diversion. There's a need that is far greater than the resource. And the legislature is changing, as we see with telehealth becoming another facet of the medical community, that a lot of our qualified professionals are leaving these organizations that provide the frontline service and going to get into telehealth, because they can make a lot more money, or the travel nurse thing. And so what we're seeing a lot of times right now is that the need and the resource that companies that need are not necessarily matching. And so I know you're going to grow frustrated at times, because you're going to call for help for your loved one, and you're going to wish, and you're going to hope, and you're going to pray. And someone maybe at some point told you, just call 911 and the paramedics and just take them to the hospital. I promise you that's not the case. We need your loved one to go either voluntarily, or they've got to meet that criteria. Otherwise, they're going to stay in the home. And oftentimes we see those situations unravel. And that's where you start seeing law enforcement respond and they just take them to jail because I can't take them to the hospital or that treatment facility. So that's the nitty gritty of how it really works.
Luckily here in Coweta, we have, with us having the partnership with Community Service Board, our ambulances can now, and thanks to COVID, transport directly there if we're not here, and our law enforcement officers can too. We can medically clear on the scene to make sure their medical parameters are, you know, the blood pressure's not too high, blood sugar's not too high, whatever. We can take them straight there. And also talking about the, I heard something on this here, I apologize. I was touching on something else too. I was going to piggyback off you, Lieutenant, but I think you covered everything. I had it in my notes, but oh, what we do is for
later on, I'm still working in the middle of a report.
As far as the
Good day.
I'm sorry, hang on a second. There's a lot of people in here.
Yeah, let's just talk tomorrow. Okay.
So all right. When we get on the scene, our ambulances and us as a paramedic, if someone is, you're talking about answering a question, we do in the medical field, A&O times 4, alert and oriented times 4. You get the president, how many quarters make $1, what day is it? If they can answer 4 questions, and like Lieutenant said, we legally cannot force them to go. Now with a clinician, they have the ability to do their mental assessment. And if they are a threat to themselves or other, which is it's a gray area, but if they could say that they can show text messages. They said they want to hurt themselves. Well, then they still conduct their assessment. And based upon their presentation at that point, whether they've got a plan or not, or certain details, they still may or may not sign that 1013. So that we run into the same thing. You go to the same place numerous times and they're mad because we can't force someone to go. And it's like, well, legally we would be kidnapping them. So at the end of the day, it's legislation that needs to be worked on. How
does this relate in regards to families that have children under the age of 18 years old who are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder as opposed to a mental health illness like schizophrenia or major depressive disorder or something like that, where it's more of a developmental disability that impacts how they socialize and impacts how they communicate? So the mental status exam may not necessarily be the best for that population. Is that still what's used to kind of make a determination regarding taking them to the hospital or not? Or how does this kind of change depending on that population?
Well, actually in Coweta County, well, I think anywhere, GCAL has a blended response team for DD and autism spectrum. So really what they need to do is call them first. Okay, now unless somebody is hurt or injured, if somebody's been stabbed with a pencil or hit with a frying pan, or if it's gotten that far, they technically need to call the Georgia Crisis and Access line and ask for the blended DD or the AS response team. And once they're finally dispatched, they have 59 minutes to arrive. They come to the actual home and assess for intensive in-home services or intensive out-home services. Now, with that being said, sometimes it is more than 59 minutes based upon it because it's after the initial assessment over the phone. But if you have someone there, like I know we've been in that position before, and we finally, the child, I say child, he was about 17. He was calm for a while, but then he had another episode and they finally just had to put him in the deputy car and we took him to Noonan's ER. So they actually, we were still on the phone. We were on the phone for 2 hours. We actually got them to divert and go to the ER. But that's what they're actually supposed to do is GCAL's blended response team.
And I'll piggyback on what Russell was saying. So I saw the question in the chat about, or the comment in the chat about a lot of the focus being on mental health and not necessarily on developmental disabilities, autism spectrum disorder, and things of that sort. And a lot of our young folks and teenagers and young adults are getting locked up when they actually are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And that's a true statement. I can't come and give you a powder puff answer. I'm not a politician. What I can say is there are folks that are getting wrapped up in the criminal justice system because of illness-related behaviors. And that's where you see a lot of the focus is being paid on on creating these crisis response units in this model that we're seeing starting to become prevalent throughout the metro area, in the state, and the country. And that is because there are folks that are getting arrested because of illness-related behaviors. And so we need to continue that focus, continue to have those conversations and demand that through our elected representatives, because oftentimes if we don't have that trained person, I'm not talking about just an officer in crisis intervention, but a trained mental health professional who's trained to recognize all of these things and diagnose it and go just beyond that crisis, that quick, rapid assessment. That's where you start to really see that delineation between, hey, this is this versus this is that. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, here in the state of Georgia, a lot of the folks that are getting arrested, you'll see the decision to make an arrest based off other laws that were not necessarily publicizing, like the family violence law. And so if you've contacted law enforcement because there's been some sort of physical altercation between yourself and your loved one, and there's some sort of injury or some property damage, we can substantiate that an act of family violence has occurred. The law doesn't give you the opportunity or the option to say, oh, I don't want to press charges, I want them to go to the hospital. A lot of times the law says to the officer, well, it's not a lot of times, all the times the law says to the officer, hey, if there's probable cause an act of family violence occurs, then an arrest is in order. And so you see a lot of times that your loved one may have an outburst, or they've damaged property, taking a television and throwing it, or they've torn up the house because they're having that episode of that reaction. And the police department shows up, or the sheriff's office shows up, they look at it and say, hey, this is criminal trespass, or this is a felony amount of property damage, or he or she did assault the mother or the father, or they did pull a knife at one point, but you were able to calm them down and de-escalate that. And the officer looks at that and say, hey, an act of family violence has occurred. And so an arrest is in order based upon the law. And so unfortunately, it's not necessarily a matter of the mental illness or the developmental disability. It's a matter of, from the law's perspective, that an act of family violence has occurred. Governor Deal, before his term expired, he did one of the greatest things that I think ever happened in criminal justice in the state of Georgia, and started passing accountability courts. And so you started seeing with the accountability courts is folks were now getting into what we call the treatment courts. And so you see, treatment courts based on drug use. There are also mental health courts. In DeKalb County, here in DeKalb County, we have a misdemeanor mental health court. And Judge Stroud and her team have done an excellent job dealing with those offenders who have been arrested. And they can say specifically, hey, this is related to an illness-related behavior. So whether it's shoplifting, whether it's a simple assault, as long as it's a misdemeanor, instead of going and getting jail time, they can go to this accountability court or this treatment court, who provides them that continuing support throughout their journey. And it's not necessarily a criminal thing, but I just wanted to let folks know that a lot of times that the law says to an officer, hey, if this is an act of family violence or this has occurred, you don't necessarily have that discretion to not arrest folks. A lot of times if it's a low-level misdemeanor like shoplifting or something, disorderly conduct, the officers will just say, hey, you know what? We'll take them to the treatment facility and we won't arrest them. And so there's more behind the scenes that go into those decisions to arrest than what it looks like on the surface. Because at the same time, the officers are also balancing that, hey, if I don't do something now, I can't take them to the hospital voluntarily, and there's not enough to meet the criteria for involuntary treatment or an evaluation. I run the risk of leaving this person in the home and coming back to a much, much more different situation where someone's been injured or killed. And that's one of the biggest things that they have to weigh. The liability to that individual officer, the liability to the agency, and the liability to the people who remain in the home. If I leave your loved one there after they've just grabbed a pair of scissors and charged that you are threatening you, and I didn't arrest them for simple assault or aggravated assault, whatever that charge may be, am I going to come back today, tonight, tomorrow, and someone has been stabbed? And I can tell you from my personal experience that I've seen that happen. A lot of times you see on the news the murder-suicides that occurred on Tuesday, and then they go back and they look at it and say, hey, the deputies or the police officers were out on Friday or the night before, the morning before, or the school call on this suicide and said that this person was behaving this way, and they go in and the police officer said, hey, there was nothing we could do. And so a lot of times hands are tied. Past incidents inform present decisions and future decisions. And so unfortunately, that's the complete calculus that first responder has to take into account when they're at your home or at your place of business dealing with that crisis.
What other policies or laws come up that it would be helpful for families to be aware of when they are calling for first responders to come and assist them? Two that I can think off the bat for me that I'm learning is the fact that the police officer has to be the first to clear a scene. I don't think I knew that. So what other things are there that families are not likely to be aware of, but that are standard policies that you just have to follow, that's not really an option that you get to make?
I'll start. Our biggest policy at Coweta County Fire, and you're probably going to find this policy throughout the state of Georgia, if any type of violence is involved, whether it's simply, say your loved one is having a breakdown and is destroying property inside the home. At any given point, any object in that room can be construed as a weapon. So therefore, we as fire department and EMS are required by our policy to stage for law enforcement. A lot of loved ones call and say, look, I don't need the police department here roughhousing my loved one. I just need an ambulance or a fire truck. We're required by policy and by standard operating procedure to stage in the area. We respond to the area and stage until that law enforcement officer says, okay, the scene is safe for you to enter. That is one of the biggest policies. There are situations, and it's a case-by-case situation. We have certain patients that we deal with on a regular basis that we know for a fact that that person can be violent with items within the home. However, once you start removing him from that situation, I've got one patient in particular that's in my first response area that this particular patient, when he's overstimulated, he starts destroying everything. And we've set aside an area that is very low on objects that can stimulate him. And the minute I arrive on the scene, I'm normally the first person there because unless there's a sheriff's deputy in the area, it's right down the street from my fire station. I go ahead and make entry based on past and touch base with him. And of course, he immediately recognizes me and says, okay, you want to go to this spot and sit and talk. And he'll stop exactly what he's doing, set everything down, and he'll walk out. So it is a case-by-case situation, and that is something that we don't take very lightly because unfortunately, as firemen, we're not allowed to carry any type of protection. So if that loved one does not come out of that particular situation and calm down pretty quickly, we're standing there with the same situation that mom and dad has.
I'd like to piggyback too. This specific patient we've been to numerous times, and Lieutenant Sims does have he made that connection with him. Somebody usually ends up making a connection anyways in these instances. So Lieutenant Sims made a really good connection with this patient, and that's why they'll go in every time. And he already, by the time, because we're Coweta Cares, if we're at our station, we're probably 20 minutes away, if not more, depending on traffic, even emergency. But Lieutenant Sims will have him calm down and sitting on the porch or something like that by the time we get there, every time we get there. And I think that's important too, is usually find somebody that they'll connect with that they like and let that person be the person that communicates with them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to piggyback on the piggyback. So hopefully it's not getting too heavy for you, Lieutenant Sims, with both of us piggybacking on you. So the first one I think is very important. We talked about the need for firefighters and EMS to wait for the sheriffs or the police officers to make sure the scene is safe. You all may remember just 7, 8, maybe 10 years ago, Gwinnett firefighters were taken hostage on a 911 call. That happens more often than you know. They'll respond to it just a regular medical call, or a regular welfare check, or a psych call, and they'll get inside of a home and they don't know what's in your house. Typically in the house, they know their knives, but they don't know their guns, they don't know their bombs, they don't, all these other things that could potentially be present. Next thing you know, they face the, mortal danger that they don't have the tools or the training, the equipment to handle. And so it's not the best solution to just send them in that situation because somebody called 911. And you may say, well, it's just a mental health thing, or it's just an autism thing, or whatever it may be. And that's fine. It was that until 3 or 4 or 6 people show up that they weren't expecting, or they hear something in the radio that alters their behavior, or the uniform. A lot of times that uniform can be triggering. Or, a lot of times families will call 911 and say, hey, send the ambulance, we tell them don't turn the sirens on. And depending on the EMS agency, they'll tell you we don't respond to emergency calls without the siren. And so you say, I don't want the lights and the siren, but next thing you know, it's an ambulance and fire truck outside your house. Well, lights flashing and the siren. And so that situation that you called 911 for is now no longer the situation that the responders are there to handle. And so they find that situation has quickly outpaced what they came for. And so that's why
another thing you can put in the notes.
Yep.
Right there is the lights and sirens. I was going to touch on that too. Thanks. Yeah.
And so a lot of times that's why you'll see those responding agencies that you didn't request showing up. And I think it's a best practice. It's not something that they just do in Coweta. That's something that and it's not just a state of Georgia thing. It's a national standard. And they find that, hey, it keeps our firefighters and our EMS protected and keeps them safe and keeps them going back home to their families. So that's critically important. And then the second one I mentioned was the family violence law. A knowledge of the family violence law, and I don't say that to discourage anyone from contacting 911. It's important at an emergency that you contact 911. And I saw a comment where it was talking about the decisions that judges make and how they handle and deal with folks with autism spectrum disorder. We have no control over the decisions that judges make, and the ability of the accountability courts and the treatment courts to provide assistance. Who does have that authority is your elected representatives. The elected representatives pass the laws that give the judges the guidance to do what they do. And so if you find that the laws and the judges don't have that, the support and the legal authority to do the things that you think should be done, by all means, contact NAMI. NAMI is a great grassroots organization, has tremendous sway in the legislature. Contact the legislature and demand action. Just like we demand action on other things, whether it's a hate crime law or a gun law or something, demand action on health, mental health reform, to make sure that support is there in those emergencies. But understanding that those are the two main things that I think guide a lot of what you see. That's why when you call and ask for an ambulance, the cops show up because it's a national best practice and standard. And that's why a lot of times when your loved one has tore up the house or grabbed some scissors and you've de-escalated and calmed down and the cop shows up and they arrest them, it's because the family violence law exists. And they're looking at ways to keep everybody safe, including the loved one. Because, and I've said it before, and I think I said it just a few minutes ago, if we show up and we don't, intervene in that situation where it was just scissors now, what happens if we come back an hour, 2 hours later, or in the middle of the night when someone's been stabbed, and it's often too late for someone.
And are there age limitations here? So I'm thinking about some of my clients who do engage in pretty aggressive behaviors, but are 10 years old, but that those behaviors are aggressive, right? So they are engaging in biting, hair pulling, hitting, throwing items, chasing family members with knives. Would that 10-year-old still be someone that?
No. So in the state of Georgia, and in the state of Georgia, you have to reach a certain age to be charged with a crime. 10 years old is younger than that age, so a 10-year-old is not going to be arrested. A lot of times what we've seen, and it really depends on where you're located, but in the larger metropolitan counties where the demand on the juvenile justice system is so great, they have a point system. And if they don't have the certain required numbers of points, they won't even detain them. And so it's truly a case-by-case situation. If you have, you may have someone who has frequently aggressive behaviors and has committed that crime of aggravated assault or battery on their parent, and they've reached that certain number of points in their juvenile justice system then says, okay, we're going to detain them. I can tell you that is the exception, not the norm. A lot of times the juvenile justice system prefers to keep children with their family because they find that that's the best supportive environment. And so there is no need to worry that your 10-year-old is going to be arrested because they knocked the TV off, because they chased you with the knife. Oftentimes they're not gonna, because they're 10 years old, they won't be charged with the crime. But if it's your 13-year-old, there's a great possibility that they will be arrested or detained for the juvenile justice authorities. And a lot of times that's not saying they're going to take him and send him to, boot camp or juvenile detention and give him a year in juvenile lockup. That's not the case. They're going to have a hearing, and they're going to involve the parent or the guardian to see, hey, what's the history behind it? Because approaching the juvenile justice system is more about supportive restoration and rehabilitation of that family unit, because they see that doesn't benefit the community, just lock a bunch of kids up behind a metal door and hope over time that the situation changes, because research suggests that's not the case. But if it's an adult, oftentimes they are going to go to jail. Jail is not prison. You see that now where with a lot of the violent crime that we're facing, folks are getting arrested several times for crime and they're right back on the street because the criminal justice system says, hey, we're not going to arrest you and detain you, send you to prison for shoplifting or for disorderly conduct. But if you murder, there are folks who walk amongst us who've committed murder, and the criminal justice system says, hey, 6, 7, 8 years is enough. And so I would say that that's not necessarily a guarantee every single time. But you have to have some faith in the system. And if you don't like the way the system functions, contact your elected representative to get it changed.
I want to touch on the age real quick. I meant when you said something about ages, it reminded me. For the GCAL blended response team, it's ages 4 years and older, just for information. And then our adolescent children cares campus, the crisis stabilization unit, is 5 to 17 years of age. So the numbers just reminded me to bring that up.
Okay, thank you. So kind of the way the competition is going, it does bring up a question that I've had regarding older individuals, still adolescents, still not 18 years old, I think 16, 15 years old, that need to be questioned by a police officer or need to be detained either because they were the victim of a crime, or whether they have engaged in some behavior that is under investigation. You guys have gone through lots of training as first responders, but in regards to like detectives or individuals that are then interviewing people, interviewing a person with autism is very different than interviewing someone that doesn't have autism. A lot of the behaviors that you may classify as concerning may be just part of their presentation. So like lack of eye contact, lack of ability to have reciprocal conversation. How is that factored into these types of interactions to make sure that the individual with autism is being treated fairly and given an opportunity to really defend themselves and in that?
So a lot of times that's every single time it's a case-by-case basis, because we've seen that there are folks amongst us who fake illness, fake disability, because they are now encountering the criminal justice system. And so when we interact with someone, or if we question someone, we have a responsibility, a legal responsibility to make sure or articulate or to be able to prove that that person was of sound mind when they made the statements that they made. And so it's truly a case-by-case basis. When we're talking about dealing with juveniles, a lot of departments, and the law is pretty clear in my opinion, that if we're interviewing a juvenile subject, hey, we need to make sure we've made an effort to contact the parent first. And so you're going to see a lot of that taking place. I know in Brookhaven, our policy is, hey, we make that reasonable attempt to contact the parent before we ever interview a juvenile. And that's regardless of any sort of developmental disability or mental illness. And so the onus is really placed on the public safety agency to make sure that they're able to go back and articulate to a reasonable person standard that, hey, this individual was competent. We had no reason to believe that this was a case of someone who had a illness or disability. But it is a case-by-case basis.
Great. In regards to after you respond to behavioral crisis situation, should families expect a follow-up visit from the first responder after the crisis has completed, maybe a day or two later? Is that something that typically happens?
I can't speak for every department in our area. I can say that it is probably a situation that, especially in the fire service, we like to follow up with the situation. We drive around in sometimes higher than $500,000 piece of equipment that the taxpayers pay for. And kids love fire trucks. So it's nothing for me to get in the fire truck and go back and let these children that we've interacted with see us in a capacity that's fun for them. That way, if we do have another situation, oh wait, that's the guy that let me play with the fire truck. That's the guy that let me spray the water. Anything we can do to sway the children in their belief that the police officers are the coolest things in the world, that's our job. So yes, we do go back to these residents. I make it a point to go by and visit anytime I have a situation involving a child, whether it be just a child that was injured or a child with developmental disorders. We try to interact with those calls after the fact, mainly because in our line of work, we normally never hear what happened after the call. And we take these calls personally. I treat everybody that I go to as my family. And that's how I make sure that I'm offering the absolute best level of care to everyone, is I treat them like my family. So I like to know how the situation resolved. So I do follow up. And like I said, I can't speak for every department, or I can't speak for everyone within my department. I do know that there are quite a few of us at the Coweta County Fire Department that we've been doing what's now called community paramedicine long before community paramedicine became a thing. We follow up with our callers. We follow up with our patients.
Well, to add to Lieutenant Sims, we have the ability to do home visits, welfare checks. And a lot of times based on what's going on the scene, whether we'll make a decision, we need to follow up in a day or two or in 3 days with a phone call or a visit, because we're one vehicle in a 460 square mile county. So, we may make a phone call, we may go do a home visit, depending on the situation and what the needs were at the time of the crisis. And we do that a lot.
Yeah, the same here in Brookhaven. I would say a lot of times those follow-ups from our crisis unit is going to be more geared towards the suicidal folks who've contacted 911 for suicide. We're contacting them, making sure that they receive those services. But a lot of times we don't necessarily have the capacity to create that follow-up relationship with families. That's a place that we'd like to go, but unfortunately the demand on the police service right now, along with some of the retention issues that we're having in the profession, prohibit us from having that follow-up capacity to all of those participants that we're actually interacting with.
Okay. I'm glad to hear that there is an attempt, but there are some barriers in place, but there's an attempt. So one question that I think is really focusing on your own personal experiences. In the past, what have you seen work the best for families of children with autism spectrum disorder and emergency situations in regards to their communication with you? How best can caregivers prepare for having to communicate information to you quickly regarding their child's preferences, regarding their child's communication style? And in your experience, do you have any success stories of caregivers doing that, and what made that a success?
I think the absolute best thing that parents can do for any child or for any loved one, whether it is a developmental disorder or anything, is be a good patient advocate. When we arrive on the scene, don't go hands off. Don't stand back and think that you're in our way, especially with a child with a developmental disorder. We don't know your child. We don't know their verbal status. We don't know what their self-soothing techniques are. We don't know if they're, some children are just overpowered by stimulation in the room. I've got several patients that I go to in Coweta that I've actually recommended the loved one set aside one room with absolutely zero visual or audio stimulation in that room. Tell us that when we arrive on the scene. A lot of times when we arrive on the scene, the parents, like Russell said earlier, they're just at their wits' end. They're just ready to throw in the towel. Don't give up on your child. Tell us what their verbal status is. Tell us what they do to self-soothe, because the last thing we want to do is arrive on the scene and take away that one item that they have. We may consider that item a distraction, or in the case of law enforcement, they may consider that item a weapon. So let us know up front, my child uses that as a self-soothing item. Please don't take that away from him. That will make the situation worse. The biggest thing is just be upfront with us. We're there to help you. We're not there to take over the scene. We're not there to deal with the situation and pull you out of the situation. Let us know what works best. Let us know how we need to approach things, and just be a good patient advocate.
Yeah, from the law enforcement side, I think that the best thing that I would say is remain calm. A lot of times you become hyper aggressive, not hyper aggressive, but hyper responsive to everything that you're seeing, everything that you're dealing with. And so the police officer walks in to a situation where you're emotionally charged, your child or your loved one is emotionally charged. And now instead of the focus being on your loved one, the focus is on, hey, this parent who is falling out, who is angry, aggressive, demanding that I do something, or to borderline, obstructive. So that I think that would be the best thing. A lot of times, what we see in any of these situations, whether it's a missing person or something like that, the law enforcement officer responds and they have typically a checklist of things that they have to do. So if your child is going missing, a lot of agencies, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to search your home to make sure the child isn't hiding. And so there are a lot of parents who say, what are you doing? I've already searched the home. I've already searched my home. You're wasting time. Not knowing that, hey, the agency or the officer has a checklist or an obligation or a mandate by policy to search the home again, because there have been a lot of times where a child is going missing and they've done the whole run up, police dogs, helicopters, all those things. And the child was hiding in the closet or underneath the bed. And so for you, you're going to say, I've already searched under the bed. I've already done those things, but you did them quick because you were panicked. And so you didn't see the child laying on the sofa under the blanket. And I speak from experience. That's happened, where the parent called us and the child was literally sleeping on the sofa under their favorite blanket. And the parent just missed it because they were so emotionally charged that their small child was missing. So doing your best to remain calm, understand that the things we're doing are not because we are trying to minimize your emergency, but because a lot of times it's because we have policies and procedures in place that have been tested and been researched to show that, hey, this gives us the best chance at a positive outcome. And that's what I would say from the law enforcement side, is just keep that in mind. Lieutenant Sims brought up, your child may have something that soothes you, and the police officer, sheriff's deputy may see that as a weapon. And they've been trying to look at it that way, because there have been times where a police officer or a deputy has not looked at it as something as a weapon, and it was used defensively against them, and they received a great bodily injury or death. And so they've been trained to look at, hey, how can this harm myself or another person? Not because, we're so amped to think somebody's out to get us or kill us. No, but because everybody has a loved one they're trying to return home to. And the training is to make sure that you do that. And so just be mindful of that. There may be things that you want done that we can't do from a legal standpoint, or from a best practice standpoint or policy standpoint.
And I'm really interested in this checklist that you have kind of brought up. Can you tell us a little bit more about the checklist itself regarding to a wandering child, or other checklists that are available?
Yeah, so and I think the fire service is probably going to be the same way. We have a policy that dictates how we respond to missing persons, and then within that policy, this is how you respond to a critical missing person. And this is someone who has a documented illness, medical, developmental, or otherwise, that says, hey, like I said, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to conduct a search of the home, and then after that, we're going to make sure that we interview the parent to not only determine, hey, what was the last time you saw your child. And if I could pause for that for a second, this seems basic, but have a recent photo of your child. You'd be shocked by the number of folks when you ask them for a photo of the child, they go pull the photo that they took in the 3rd grade at picture day at school, and the child is now in high school, because they don't have a recent picture of their child. So have a recent picture handy, because that is a big piece. You know, okay, this is how they look. How do they look now? But getting back onto my original thought process. So the policy is search the home, then interview the parent, determine when was the last time we saw them, where did they normally go? And what we're trying to do is determine a safety circle or a safety zone. There's a place that your child feels safe. There are places that you feel safe when you leave the house. And so, you know, if I went missing from the home, my wife would say, hey, these are places he normally goes. These are places he likes to frequent. Your child has the same thing, and we determine that to be the safety zone. And that safety zone is the areas that we're going to concentrate our search from the beginning. And so if your child normally if you take your child to Dave & Buster's in Marietta once, and they liked it, that wouldn't necessarily be in the safety zone. But if there's a local park that they go to each and every day, then that may be in their safety zone. Or if there's a friend, a lot of times, and this is another one, recently had a child go missing and the mother says he has no friends. Your child has friends. You may not know those friends, but they have friends. So that's another important piece. And so we're going to do those things. We're going to look at that safety zone and say, okay, this is the place that this person feels most safe and free to move about. Because if it's a small child, they may not feel safe doing this. So we're going to do that. Lieutenant mentioned earlier about the bodies of water. There may be a creek or pond in your neighborhood that we know nothing about, because the only time we've gone to the neighborhood is we've gone to homes and things of that sort, but we haven't gone 3 acres behind your 10-acre property. So we wouldn't know about that body of water back there. So you're going to know that. So we're going to ask you about those things. And then the policy dictates that, hey, after a certain number of hours, we're going to contact this person, or we're going to contact this agency. We're going to bring in this resource. And so I can't give you the whole playbook because I don't have it here in front of me, but any good public safety agency, and one that is either accredited through CALEA or through certified through the Georgia Chiefs Association and participates in that program, has a policy that gives them a step-by-step guide, the things that to do when they're responding to those calls. So we're not shooting from the hip.
I'll also add another thing, bringing up missing children that have walked away. Both myself and Russell are both certified through the National Association of Search and Rescue. And that is a national-based certification program that deals with missing persons. And a lot of times when we arrive on the scene, as Lieutenant was pointing out, we're overloading you with questions. We have a missing person questionnaire that we will fill out in its entirety before we start sending personnel into the woods. There's a lot of information that we do need to know before we start sending resources out. If we're dealing with an autistic child, we're looking at primary search areas and we're looking at secondary search areas. Those primary search areas is that creek that's on the backside of your subdivision. The lake, those are our primary search areas. Those are our highest risk areas that we're going to send a hasty team to go out and search immediately. As soon as they arrive on the scene and we establish that we do have a missing person, we've cleared the home, they're going to a hasty team and they're going to those primary search areas. So as Lieutenant said, when we do arrive on the scene and we start asking all these questions, a lot of the times the parents are just overwhelmed with, you're wasting time. They're missing and you're standing here asking questions. There's a reason for those. It is a formulated set of guidelines that we all go by to deal with a missing persons case.
Very good to know. And is there anywhere that families can access this information online where there's like a step-by-step of make sure you have a recent picture, make sure you have a printout of local bodies of water, something to kind of help them put together a toolkit basically to help prepare them for some of these emergency situations?
You can contact your the local fire departments. Check with your EMAs in your counties, your emergency management agencies. They've got CERT teams. They deal with a lot of that. Just go if they don't have it at the fire department, they will be able to direct you to who. It may be the sheriff's department, it may be the EMA, it may be the city fire department, but they'll be able to get you in that direction normally to find out those. Like our 911 has, they have all my information bag. So when we go out and do our visits, it's a Ziploc bag that puts all the medical information on it, contacts, allergies, all this in case someone can't speak or they're not verbal or whatever reason, they're unconscious. And it's a bright orange AMI sticker that goes on the freezer where you take that Ziploc bag once it's filled out and you stick it in the freezer in the door. Well, EMS crews see that orange sticker and they say information's in there. So that's being proactive, and our 911 does that. Our 911 actually does a lot of things that you would think that the fire EMS would have come up with. So reach out to all the agencies, your 911, your EMA, your fire, your EMS. Some places have private EMS companies. But if it's a county based, they're going to have more probably to offer in the way of those kind of resources. But just check with your local departments and let them point you in the right direction.
Okay. And one question that came up that I think was somewhat answered earlier, but I just want to make sure that we specifically discuss it. When you make the determination that the child is not going to be safe in their home based on their own challenging behaviors or based on an injury or something, or that the family won't be able to stay safe with the child still in the home, do parents have an option or a say in regards to which hospital they're taken to? Do they have a say in regards to which type of service they receive next?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So I have had some families tell me that they have asked to go to, let's say, Eggleston here in Atlanta, but then told that they couldn't. They had to go to a different hospital, Grady or something like that. Is there no regulations that kind of prohibit that?
Here in Coweta County, we have an SOP that is based upon mileage.
50 miles.
If we pick up your child, we can transport your child to any receiving hospital in a non-emergency situation that is 50 miles from the closest county border to that hospital. Here in Coweta, Scottish Rite is outside of our 50-mile range. However, Eggleston is within the 50-mile range. Now, that is for a non-life-threatening transport. If, say, for instance, your child has injured himself during his breakdown and it is a life-threatening injury, at that point, we are required to transport to the closest hospital that is appropriate for that person's injuries. So if you have a parent that has said in the past, well, I asked to go to Eggleston, they told me I had to go here, that may be based upon a policy within the department they interacted with. Because like I said, here in Coweta, we have a 50-mile range. And if that hospital is 52 miles outside of that range, if it's 2 miles outside of that range, our paramedics can still elect to go to that if that's the best location to treat the child. But based upon the 50-mile range, that's what we're limited to.
And on the police side, we don't do a lot of transports because of the liability that comes with transporting someone. We're not trained, paramedics or EMTs. So you don't see a lot of transports happening. When it comes to adults, the law says the nearest emergency receiving facility. And so a lot of times you're going to see the police department transfer to that nearest emergency receiving facility because the primary function of police is law enforcement. And so we have to have that. We have to have those police officers on the street to answer the 911 calls. As that happens. A lot of times you may see you want them to go here, you want them to go to north side of St. Joseph's, and north side of St. Joseph's may be on psych diversion, and so we can't take them there. We have to take them to Grady. We may have to take them to another facility that you didn't choose because the facility that you asked us to take them to was on psych diversion, and so that's a lot of times that happens as well.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what psych diversion is, and then also what receiving hospital? Just kind of walk us through.
I'm gonna let the fire service handle that one.
You don't have just psych diversion. You'll have they'll alert all our stations every day, multiple times. They can be on ER saturation diversion. We hear Southern Regional go on psych diversion nearly every day. That means they're completely full. They don't have any beds. They don't have any beds about to come available. They're like, please don't bring anybody else here. At the end of the day, they can't turn people away. But at the end of the day, it causes a lot more headaches for a lot more people. So if you can find an alternate destination, you have people that you're supposed to be able to take someone non-emergency, like Lieutenant Timms was saying, if it's not life-threatening, where they want to go within 50 miles. But we're like, hey, look, Grady is on diversion. They're full. They're telling us to not to bring anybody else there. Can we take you to Noonan for this? Or can we take you to Fayette for this? Or Carrollton? Diversion, they can't necessarily turn you away legally, but they are asking you and telling you very politely that they are completely full, and the ambulance may be there holding the wall with the patient on a stretcher for up to 4 hours. That happens sometimes. So it's more of a strong suggestion, but it makes it, that's where Coyote Cares comes in. We try to keep people out of the ER. So at the end of the day, that's part of the problem, trying to be part of the solution. But the diversion just means that they're overwhelmed. They don't have enough people. They got too many patients, and please try to find an alternate destination.
Okay, that makes sense. And receiving hospital is a hospital that is willing to take patients in that category.
Yes.
Okay. Well, those are all the questions that we had outlined for the panelists. I want to open it up to the community members to ask any additional questions that they do have. I know some people were asking as we were going.
Okay, and Nadi, I did send a bunch of questions your way in the chat, on a one-on-one chat of some of the ones that have come through that sounded like they would be the most valuable for our panelists to answer as a group.
Oh, okay, yes, I'm seeing a lot more questions now.
I can just organize them a little bit easier for you.
Perfect, and you sent them kind of all together. There we go.
Mm-hmm.
So one question regarding GCAL is basically asking if first responders ever call GCAL for help. So you are already responding to a call and then you call for help in regards to GCAL as opposed to having caregivers call. This individual said that their experience as a psychiatric provider with GCAL has been mixed. Are there ways that first responders and GCAL could work together more effectively? And I will also kind of second that as a provider with this population, that it does seem like GCAL is what we recommend to families, but very few of my families are actually able to use GCAL in a crisis situation, because by the time GCAL is able to respond, first responders have already responded and they're already either at the hospital or have calmed down in the home. It doesn't seem to be staffed enough to be able to support
they're very short-handed. They're very short-handed. That is true, and it's a tool in your toolbox, essentially, especially in Coweta. Like I said, Cobb Fire, they have their own. We have our own, and there's other. Grady has one similar. there are places that have these kind of units. You can try GCAL. If you'll reach out to GCAL, like Lieutenant was saying a while ago, way before we get to the point where they're throwing things and trying to hurt people, if you'll see, if a lot of times you can recognize your child, all right, there's a trigger. I've seen this before and it's going to escalate. Call GCAL right then, because then you have that long response time. But by the time they get there, you're just to the point when they need to be arriving. And I agree with that. Yeah, they're very understaffed, just like a lot of other places. And we will already have handled that situation. So it's just a tool in your toolbox that you can try to use. They're really trying to hire more people. It's just like us. We're trying to hire more people. But we do, and we have contacts with GCAL that we wanted to, we were actually about to sit down with several of them, then COVID hit. So we just, and then we couldn't meet anybody and all that. So now we're trying to get back to that point. I still have their contact. We're going to reach out and try to meet with them more, to have more of a collaboration between them. They know what we're going to do. We know what they're going to do, just that relationship to be able to work smoothly together here in Coweta.
Another question, if you call 911 and all the ambulance, the fire truck, police officer, everyone comes out, and then the issue gets resolved at the scene, does the family get charged for that visit?
Not in Coweta. And I can't speak for other places like private ambulance services, but in Coweta, if we come out and crisis resolved, no bill, no anything. Now, I can't speak for a private ambulance service or whatever, how their protocols are, but most time your government-based EMS is not going to charge for that unless they've changed in the recent past. But in Coweta, we don't.
The only situation in Coweta that we do bill for is if we treat on the scene with medications. A lot of times we have diabetic emergencies that can be resolved with medications on our ambulances. And we do bill for those instances where we're utilizing equipment off of the ambulance. And it's a $200 bill, and that recuperates the medications and supplies used. But as Russell said, in Coweta, if we arrive on the scene and we mitigate the scene, calm the scene down, and leave the scene in the hands of the parents, there is no bill received from our fire or EMS side.
But if the family does then need transportation to emergency room or additional service, they will get that bill?
Correct.
Coweta Cares does not bill if we transport as of now because of Medicaid, Medicare, all their little red tape and everything. We can't bill with our police. It's a police interceptor Explorer. So we transport all the time. And whoever we transport, we don't charge. But if an ambulance takes them, they can charge insurance or whatever.
Okay. And this next question is one that we have touched on, but I think that some additional clarity would be helpful. So if an individual with autism is having an aggressive meltdown, family calls 911, will the police officer take them into custody for assault, or will they take into account the fact that they have autism, potentially a cognitive delay, and try to de-escalate the situation? And kind of how do you guys make that determination? Because I imagine that there's a difference between someone that doesn't have verbal abilities, isn't able to talk back and forth with you, engaging in pretty aggressive behaviors, versus someone that does have better skills or better but different skills.
So the officers are looking specifically at the facts and the circumstances as that they played out at that time. And so it is when I say case by case, it is literally a case by case basis, truly based on what has occurred. They do take into account some previous history. And so it would be irresponsible for me to say yes or no, because no situation is the same. Nothing is routine. It is truly based upon the facts and circumstances that present themselves on that particular incident. And so it is truly that is the most case by case basis thing that we ever deal with.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm going through the questions, and I think I've touched on the questions that were asked so far, but it doesn't mean that there won't be any additional questions. This has been very, very helpful and insightful to me, even to be able to share with my family. I just really appreciate you guys taking the time. Is there anything you can think of that we haven't touched on that you think is important for families to be aware of, whether it's just additional information or things that they can do to prepare?
I'm going to send our.
Go ahead. You got it.
I was just going to say, I was going to email you in our guidebook, the GCAL, our crisis service for autism and developmental disabilities. Mm-hmm. We give this to families. I'll send you an email of that to share. Also, the crisis services and the family support services that comes through our community service board, which is Pathways. But I think even though that there's different community service boards, that they all have the same kind of resources available.
Wonderful, that'd be amazing.
The biggest thing I would say is don't delay. Whether that's dialing 911 in a crisis situation or in getting your loved one diagnosed and getting help when the signs and the symptoms first present themselves. A lot of times we're responding to calls and folks are saying, oh, this person has this disorder, this disability. And then you do your research and you come to find out they were never actually diagnosed by a professional. They were diagnosed by a family member. A family member suspected that they had schizophrenia or whatever the disability or the illness may have been, because we've delayed and we've been in denial about it. Don't be in denial. Don't be immune to the fact that illness affects and disability affects anybody and everybody, and it looks different. So when you have that suspicion, get your loved one the evaluation and the treatment they need, because that delay oftentimes can be detrimental in the long term. Just like if your house is on fire, you wouldn't wait to say, oh, let me see if it burns the whole thing down before I call the fire department. No, that's a mistake you only make once if it is. But the moment you see some smoke and you see some fire, you're gonna call 911 because you want them to come to put the fire out. And I look at that situation the same way across the board. When you first see the signs or some symptoms of something that is occurring, reach out and get help, and be an advocate. That's been said many times tonight, be an advocate for your loved one, whether it's in the doctor's office, whether it's with the elected representative. Be an advocate, and don't deny what you're seeing, because if you're taking that wait and see approach and you're not actually pushing for your loved one, the situation is coming. You're gonna be standing on the tracks when the train comes. Are you gonna be prepared, or are you gonna wait till it runs you over? And that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Completely agree. Time is something that we always think we have more of. So in these emergency situations, definitely important. And then also in regards to early diagnosis and early treatment. Okay, well, I think that is everything that we have to offer. I don't see any additional questions. Once again, I just really want to thank you guys for taking your time on a Monday to talk with us about the work that you do. And thank you for doing the work that you do, and for serving our communities and really trying to make sure that we are protected and able to access the resources that are there.
Absolutely.
Thank you for having us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah. And on behalf of the Atlanta Autism Consortium, we appreciate all of our panelists for giving their time tonight, and to Dr. Nuhu for serving as our moderator. For all of our attendees who joined us tonight, thank you also for being here. There was so much incredible information shared, and we know that most likely some of you will have questions that come up after tonight's program. So be on the lookout for an email from us tomorrow with the contact information for our panelists. We appreciate you giving your time, and we look forward to seeing you again at a future AAC program. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.